My name is Lynette Ong. I'm a professor of political science at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto. And I wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates for thousands of years. It has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat and the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. And this event is co-sponsored by the Munk School of Global Affairs and the Center for Chinese Research, Institute of Asian Research at the University of British Columbia. And let me introduce today's speakers. David Ownby is one of the speakers. He recently retired from the history department of the University of Montreal and is currently a research associate at the Max Planck Institute for Social Anthropology in Germany. His most recent work focuses on intellectual life in contemporary China, and he is the founder of the website Reading the China Dream. And if you have not been to the website, it is a huge source of public goods for the China research community, and that contains a lot of very valuable translated materials, which I believe David did most of the translation himself. So I would encourage you to check out the website if you have not done so already. We also have Professor Timothy Cheek with us, who is Professor and Louis Char Chair in Chinese Research at the University of Asian, at the Institute of Asian Research in the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs and Department of History at the University of British Columbia. He has recently been elected to the Royal Society of Canada. His research and teaching focus on the recent history of China, especially the role of Chinese intellectuals in the 20th century and the history of Chinese Communist Party. Most recent publications include The Chinese Communist Party, A Century in 10 Lives, published in 2021 with Cambridge University Press. And today they will talk about, I will be moderating and chairing this event. They will be talking about intellectuals and public life in Xi Jinping's China today. So back in 2018, Timothy Cheek and David Ownby joined forces to write an article in Dissent called Make China Marxist Again, that addressed Xi Jinping's effort at reviving the CCP's ideology on the anniversary of Marx's birth and the response of some of China's establishment intellectuals, particularly among the orthodox legal scholar Jiang Sigong. So what has happened to intellectual life in China in the last 5 years since the article was published, particularly those issues, and for those intellectuals interested in big issues of governance. I think this is a very timely and really important subject. So I'm really looking forward and very fortunate to have both of them with us today. I think this is particularly important after the end of zero COVID, when the society seems kind of adrift and into some sort of resigned mode. So welcome, Timothy and David, and I'll pass the virtual floor on to you.
Thank you very much, Lynette. David and I have conspired together, and I'm going to start. But first, I want to thank you, Lynette, for bringing us together, and the Munk School for hosting this opportunity. I agree with you. It's a good time to be talking about this and wondering about what is going on in living with Xi or Xi's China. In 2018, David and I chose the title Make China Marxist Again to address these same issues. Today, in 2023-24, I would say making the party revolutionary again, or make the party revolutionary again. Xi's new mantra seems to be 自我革命, self-revolution. Compared to 2018, when we looked at the public campaign for studying Marxism that embraced, take a breath, Xi Jinping thought on socialism with Chinese characteristics for the new era. In comparison, the current campaign seems much more internally focused. That is, we're not having TV shows about this like we did back then. And it's more focused on the party and the state administration. The public, it seems, need only turn up to cheer when required and to refrain from annoying historical nihilism, or worse, disruptive social justice claims that aid and abet splitism. What is this self-revolution? David Kelly brings us a recent example. Long a bastion of the Maoist left, the Kundun web portal posted a recent sharp attack on contemporary laxity. This piece is by Wang Lihua, a vice president of the Kunlun Research Institute. Wang echoes Xi Jinping's reversion to party self-revolution theme at the recent Central Discipline Commission on Discipline meeting. She said, quote, as for those party members, Wang says, as for those party member leading cadres who demand a change in the party and PRC constitutions, totally changing the dominant position of public ownership and privatizing public sector for private purposes, they should be sorted out as the focus of the party's self-revolution. And lest we are unclear about the invocation of the loaded political term sorting out or cleansing, qingli, which is very popular in the Cultural Revolution, Wang continues, they have betrayed the party's political credo. If they succeed, they will bring great disasters to the state and the people. The tragedy of the collapse and demise of the Soviet Union must not be repeated in China. And this is a theme we saw in 2018, and we know that Xi Jinping himself raised it back in 2012 and 2013. Underneath these developments and change in focus, there is a continuity. The commitment of Xi Jinping and the party leadership that supports him to continue ideological governance. So what is this ideological governance? And what does it amount to? It can be seen in what Xi Jinping said in 2018 at the conference celebrating the 40th anniversary of Reform and Opening. Xi Jinping said, party and government, soldiers and civilians, and schools, the East, West, North, South, and Center, the party leads them all. To uphold the party's leadership, which is a major principle that determines the future destiny of the party and the country, the entire party and the whole country must, without any wavering, maintain a high degree of ideological consciousness, political consciousness, and consciousness of action. The key to this passage is the last sentence. Upholding the party's leadership that determines the future of China relies on consciousness. Xi Jinping uses the term 自觉 here, but he frequently talks in terms of 意识 for consciousness. We have other talks and places where he does that, but we don't need to repeat them today. Xi makes clear that the driving force behind the success of Yan'an and the Chinese Revolution was the revolutionary spirit, 革命精神, and the spirit of arduous struggle, 艰苦奋斗. And of course, he's now also added that to the securitization focus in recent years. But what I want to focus on here, because it's going to transition to the folks David's talking about, is the key term, ideological governance. Ideological governance asserts a role for the government as a pedagogical state that has the responsibility to provide order and prosperity through civilizing its citizens according to the superior insights of a certified transformational bureaucracy, certified transformational bureaucrats, learned in a body of thought that when applied properly will bring great harmony to all under its sway, and which therefore requires and deserves freedom from all competition from alternative and presumed lesser forms of political activity. The key point here, in order to carry out this ideological governance, the party needs and also worries about intellectuals at the same time. The Chinese Communist Party's Leninist nature as an ideological organization requires transformational bureaucrats to implement its form of rule, ideological governance. And the intellectuals have been perfect for this role. Legitimated not by elections or by divine right, but by ideology as well as performance, the party needs ideologists to tell its story and mobilize popular support, including the management of emotions. Stalin called for engineers of the soul, and Chinese communists have embraced the call. Over the century of its existence, a good number of intellectuals have chosen to serve or speak for the party or speak to the party as advisors. They've done this as revolutionaries, 革命家, as thought workers under Mao, 思想工作者, and in more recent decades as experts, 专家. It is this fundamental political need to implement ideological governance that explains both the irreducible need of the party for intellectual service and its constant vigilance and concerns to ensure that these self-regarding savants stay in line. In fact, the distinction between intellectuals and the party state should not be reified because many party leaders have been intellectuals. Just think of Wang Huning. So, with that kind of outline of some of the new steps in Xi Jinping thought, what are intellectuals in China doing in this context? I turn it over to you, David.
Well, thank you, Timothy. And you've been uncharacteristically brief, giving me more time than I was expecting. And so I'll go ahead and be provocative where Tim has been serious. We both participated also in another publication, and the title of mine was something like Yada, 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 Who's Listening to Xi Jinping? I've forgotten what the title of yours was.
Ideological
of course, okay, so we said the same thing. Okay, that's good. My point, I was being intentionally silly, but my point was that you can read in Chinese intellectuals and not find any echo of the kind of stuff that you just said. And why do I say that? Because as Lynette said at the outset, I've been doing, and Tim was doing it with me for a while. We had a project that launched the website and this whole thing. I basically read public-facing intellectuals. These are basically university professors who also write with the aim of convincing other intellectuals, or basically other intellectuals, or perhaps the government, or weighing in here and there on public issues. This started out of an accident where I just happened to read a really good book and decided to follow up on it. And it became this very large thing that my mother won't read because it's too bulky. But so I read the most active period for this world that I discovered was between, say, 2005 and 2015. So China's rise up until Xi Jinping took power. He was trying to shut down some of the pluralism, which I'll talk about in just a minute, as soon as he came in, I think. But it's hard. There's just one of him, and there's lots of them, and they've been being pluralistic for a long time. So my theory about what has happened and why this is interesting is that over the course of 40 years of reform and opening in China, Chinese intellectuals were transformed as thoroughly as was the rest of China. I mean, I started going to China like 79 or 80, and China was a big mess, not functional at all. Things didn't work. And over the course of those 45 years that I've been going, China has become a thoroughly functional society, in many ways more functional than ours. If you just think in terms of airports, universities, roads, anything in China, or the cashless society, or the subway in Shanghai, China, with all its problems, has done a lot, and it did a lot by embracing globalization and markets in the 1990s because it was afraid that it was going to go the way of the Soviet Union and fall apart, because the Soviet Union had been doing the same thing and fell apart. But China played its cards better, and as a result, they got through the initial collapse that could have happened in the 1990s and went on to become a major power. And intellectuals were transformed by the same trends, by which I mean globalization. They were encouraged. I think Chinese leaders would have been happy if historians and political scientists did not globalize. They wanted technicians and scientists to go abroad and bring back the best of Western knowledge and remake China and make China competitive and all that kind of stuff. And that's largely what happened. But the others went too. I mean, people who work on history or philosophy or sociology or political science or whatever, they often went to the West to study, or if they didn't go to the West and study, they invited people from the West to speak in their institutions. Or there's also this huge translation industry in China that attacks whatever comes out of any importance, and it's available in the next year or two so that they can be well informed. And what happened then over the course of these 30, 40 years is it became a plural intellectual society. It sort of started in the 1980s. I won't talk about too much, but in the 1990s, the three groups we associate with Chinese intellectuals emerged: the liberals, the New Left, and the New Confucians. And they weren't well-defined groups, but they were groups that sort of joined together to yell at one another about important issues. They really were pretty important things they were talking about. What would reform China mean? Where would authority come from? How do we fight back neoliberalism coming at us from the rest of the world? And then it evolved over the course of the 2000s and down to the present day. At the same time, the internet came in and many publications were forced to marketize. You know, in the old days, every publication in China was a government publication. I don't know the details of this now, but most of these guys are expected to make money. They're expected to find a market, get a market. So this has multiplied the venues for intellectuals to express themselves. And to my surprise, they express themselves in a wide variety of ways and in ways that are closer to us than I would have thought. Part of this is because I tend to prefer Chinese liberals and wind up reading more of them. But I find even people who are not Chinese liberals, even so the New Confucians and the New Left, most of their intellectual references are Western rather than Chinese, which really irritates them, which I understand. It would irritate me too. But that's just kind of the way the world worked out. If you're going to globalize and invite foreign scholars to China and try to publish your work, sorry, in English language publications, that's just the way it works. So there has been, I think, a transformation more total than the one we saw in the Republican period, where we wouldn't have any trouble, most of us, having a conversation with a Chinese intellectual about most issues, even somebody who disagreed on fundamental terms about governance and the big themes that Lynette was talking about at the beginning of the show here. We would not have trouble finding common ground on which to discuss, which I don't think would be the case with, you know, when China was still Maoist. There's just a world of difference between the way we talked and they talked back then. And this has largely been eclipsed, for the better or for the worse. I say for the better because we can read them and enjoy them in ways that were less possible before this transformation happened. For the worse, I don't know. I mean, there are many Chinese who still are looking for a Chinese social science, which is hard to do. Tim talked a little bit, well, a lot about the party's call on intellectuals to help in the ideological governance campaign, or this is a constant. He's absolutely right. The government would like this very much. I think if intellectuals would get on board. I think when Xi Jinping was first coming to power, when people didn't know what hand he was going to play, I think there were efforts to lend a hand. This was especially around the issue of the New Confucians, who would really have liked for Marxism to sort of move toward a Confucian authoritarian, benevolent sort of posture. And I know the folks who were writing stuff to Daddy Xi in their talks, trying to talk him into this, that, and the other. And this generated pushback. And there was quite a lot of discussion of that sort of thing. And if you're interested, you can write to me and I'll send you specific links on the webpage to articles that are really fun to read about that. There's this really long one by a brilliant guy named Liang Zhiping, who studies law. I think he's in Hangzhou now, although he spent most of his career in Beijing. But he wrote this really long piece in a Taiwan journal about Tianxia, the all under heaven, which became sort of a trope for traditionalistic Chinese intellectuals to try to bring back what China used to be. And he wrote this 75-page piece, just going through all of it, showing the strong points and the weak points, and ending by saying, look, Xi Jinping, he could say it directly because he's writing in Taiwan. He was very polite because he was hoping to be read and to have a nice vacation or retirement with his family. But he said pretty directly, look, Xi Jinping, we know what you're doing and we agree with you. It would be really nice if people believed what you were putting out there, believed the ideology. It makes for a better society if there are shared beliefs, shared covenants, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. He didn't say it exactly like this, but what he meant to say was, you're really bad at this and we're really good at this. And we'd really like to help if you'd let us. And he wrote 75 pages showing chapter and verse how he could do it. And it's a lovely piece. It's not mean-spirited at all, nor is it sucking up. it's a model, I think, of sort of the modern stance of what a traditional scholar official would like to do, to say
Offering advice.
In this case, in a very we're equals kind of thing. I mean, this was not sucking up in the way that some of them did.
Yeah.
But most of the time, I would say that there's just not that much buy-in. What I read, and I try to read the equivalent of like the Atlantic Monthly or Harper's or New York Review of Books. There aren't Chinese equivalents of that, of course, but there are things that aspire to be. And that's what I try to read, things that are aiming at intellectuals in China who think of themselves as intellectuals and read in that way. And most of the time, they just don't even mention Xi Jinping. They don't mention any of these slogans. There's this parallel world. It's a smaller, unprotected world. A civil society that either hasn't happened or is happening. I don't know. There are no rules. There's no court of appeal. But there is this parallel world where people talk about things, write about things, and read about things, which don't have to reference Xi Jinping or the slogans or ideological governance or any of that. And I must say, to get back to Lynette and the end of COVID policy, I was in China for a little while, for a few weeks in last May. And the first thing that struck me was that I don't think anybody was reading anything. I mean, they were just unhappy. Everyone reads on their WeChat friend group thing. I mean, I felt, I hate to say this, you don't know me, but I'm a very modest person, but I felt like I was better informed about who was saying what in China than my Chinese friends were, just because they were so bummed out and not reading anything. And the other thing that I found out, which surprised me a lot, was just how impactful the disastrous end to COVID, zero COVID, had been. I mean, we all read about it, and we all know that China sort of turned on a dime, or the government turned on a dime and said, the day before, they had said COVID is a terrible scourge on mankind, and if we don't protect ourselves completely with all these protocols, et cetera, lockdowns that we're doing, then we'll all die. And then sort of overnight, they said, oh, well, it's just a cold, and if grandpa dies, he was old anyway. And this, of course, many people did not take this well. And I met people who were still deeply, deeply, deeply disturbed about this. Young people who felt like this questioned the basic competence and sincerity of the regime. The older folks sort of said, well, this isn't my first rodeo. I lost my faith at another moment. But so yes, I mean, Tim's right. They would greatly like for people to rejoin the church and sing from the hymnal and help them do some good exegesis that would get the people on the bandwagon.
David, can I jump in?
I don't think it's happening all that much. Tim, go ahead, please. Yeah.
Just to reemphasize some of the points you're making that I hope the folks at home get, that, you know, I purposely gave it an extended presentation of Xi Jinping thought, ideas, and issues precisely to sharpen the contrast. David's key point, and if you read his website, there's a huge disconnect. The intellectuals are alienated broadly from Xi Jinping's agenda. And I really liked your comparison back in 2011, 12, 13. They were trying to speak to him, but it's not been worth it. Most of the intellectuals I see echo the ones that the much broader group that David is seeing and reading. The intellectuals are trying to keep out of trouble, discussing what they can when they can, and that's especially the stuff you can see on the Reading the China Dream website, and waiting for a change. Finally, the response to zero COVID, I think you're absolutely right. It was heartbreaking disillusionment for millennials. I learned that from the people you were talking to, David. More of the same, from reminder of, as you said, previous rodeos for older intellectuals. And just for rural people, it's like, what else is new? Of course, the government screws us over. Yeah. Right. So they're not disillusioned. They're just not real thrilled. Yeah. So in other words, trying to disaggregate this a little bit, but at minimum, we're not talking about intellectuals who are really supporting the Xi Jinping regime, because we're not seeing that many.
I mean, the people like Zhang Shigong that Lynette mentioned, that you and I talked about in that piece, that the dissent piece, he's still there. I've by now translated hundreds of pages of him. He really put me off at the outset, but I can't say I've warmed to him, but he doesn't put me off
He's
as much as
smart,
he used
smart
to.
guy.
He's very smart. He's worth reading because he does his work and he writes well. But I've come to believe that what he's really trying to do is convince other intellectuals to follow him, which means to me that most Chinese intellectuals are basically liberals still. Although the United States is doing its best to convince them to think otherwise, but they would like not to. And that's what he's doing there is what I think. And that's what I think most of this discourse is them talking to one another. I don't think the young people listen to them all that much. Okay, we've done 22 minutes, Lynette.
There you go. Lynette, you can
amazing.
come in and pepper us with challenging questions.
Okay, so let me try to gather my thoughts. One thing that David mentioned and also supported by Tim is that before Xi Jinping, you have this wide distribution of intellectuals in China, from the liberals to the
New Confucian.
new left and new Confucian. So the liberals, I am familiar with most of them, like economists like Chen Yingyi from Berkeley, and a bunch of them like Mao Yushi. Would you classify him as liberals? And the new left would be people like Qin Hui, right? And
No. Qin Hui is liberal. Qin Hui is liberal.
You're thinking
liberal.
Wang Hui.
Right, the Wang Hui, and then the new Confucian would be people like Yao Yang.
Well, more like Chun Ming or Zhang Qing.
Okay.
Yao Yang is a newer example, and he kind of joined the party later on without.
Right.
The earlier guys really kind of put on the robes and
right.
really had themselves photographed
David,
looking.
David, you've done a book-length version translation of Yao Yang stuff. It might be worth having a minute letting folks know who this guy is.
Yeah, but Yao Yang is the head of Beida, the University of Peking's major think tank on the economy, National Institute of Development. And for most of his career, he was somewhere in between a market enthusiast and a new lefter. But over the last few years, the last 5 or 10 years, he's gotten disturbed by events both in the United States and China, and has been working with a younger guy who's a Confucian specialist to try to put together a Confucianism 2.0, which will, if only Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders would read it, would help America get past its identity politics and would help China get past its non-benevolence politics. So it's really well done. Said like that, it sounds ridiculous, but it's not. It's a really interesting project because he writes well. It's utopian in some ways, right? But I mean, a lot of politics is utopian, and I think go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
So before Xi Jinping's years, how would you describe the distribution? Would the liberals be in the majority, so you have kind of a left-heavy type of distribution, or is it more normally distributed, like most people would be in the middle?
Well, liberals contain multitudes. There are market enthusiasts like Moisher and people that you were talking about, and there are others who are further left and closer to some kind of socialism, and then there are others that are in between. The New Left in the 1990s was very anti-neoliberal. Most of them were educated in the West and came back with sort of postmodern thoughts. And I mean, China really needed pushback against neoliberalism in the 1990s because it was laying people off and paying no attention to poor folks at all.
Right.
Over the course of the 2000s and 2010s, the New Left sort of became statist to the point of being very close to fascist if you're not a friendly person on the New Left. The New Confucians had their moment, and I think they've taken a back seat right now. But liberals are in a majority in terms of numbers, just because that's the way China worked out. But they've lost a lot of sort of traction with China's rise because China's doing fine without being liberal. So why complain about China's lack of constitution and human rights when China was catching up with America?
Right. That was my next question. So my impression is that pre-Xi Jinping, particularly in the 90s and early 2000s, actually the liberals, particularly among the economists, actually have quite a bit of power in public discourse. They were able to advocate and then help to push through and make good suggestions about the sort of liberal policies that we see today. What they have not been so successful in is calling for institutional reform and political reform, but economic-wise, they have actually they could claim credit for a lot of liberal policies that China has adopted in the last 20 years or so. Would you agree with that?
Go ahead, Tim.
Thanks. Yes, but they actually even Deng Xiaoping got it that they were going to have to do market economy, and so. Any of the arguments that supported market economy, the party was predisposed from Zhou Rongji on to do, and you go into WTO, etc. But I do agree with you that the liberal intellectuals had real, I think, influence and also public credence for pushing liberal reforms in the economy, and good things are happening. But when they came to the second half, they were very unsuccessful in changes in the political order because the party was never going to let go. It was never going to get it from the Leninist system. But 2008 was a very important time between the Beijing Olympics and the Shangshi, right, the prosperous age, and the West shooting itself in the foot with the great global recession. That's where I began to say, even amongst David, our friends that we've been working with in Shanghai, they stopped talking about like, oh, we got to learn from the West. They were just kind of quiet and embarrassed because the West had just really fluffed it on the economy. And then we go into our populist right-wing swing in Europe and America, and they're just like, okay, guess we can't be looking in that direction anymore. And that's really weakened the public pickup for liberalism. They're really trying, I think, David, I'd like to see what you think, because you've been reading a lot more of it of late than me. They're trying to disassociate their liberal ideals from the historical example of the West, trying to make those arguments for what are some of the things that would be good for China that we would recognize as sort of liberal democracy, or at least liberal side of constraints on power.
David, what do you think?
Yeah, that's where the pro-Trump China people come from. What's misleading when we talk about Chinese liberals is that we tend to confuse them with liberals in the United States. But in the Chinese context in the 80s and 90s, it really meant neoliberal. It meant people who liked markets and just markets and as little government as possible. So a lot of these guys, these are people who really believed that the world was at its best in the 19th century, in 19th century Britain, when government was small and I don't know,
business was free,
something like that. Any slogan you can think of. And the Trump supporters now basically think of Trump as a beacon, taking America back to this Anglo-Saxon consensual past when you could actually pass bills and convince people of things out of a consensus. And it's very strange to me because these are very smart people who are extremely, they have lots of insights about their own country, of course, their own history. But when they look at the United States, they sort of let themselves go and remain on the surface. So
when you talk about Trump supporters, are they the new left or the?
No. They're all liberals.
The liberals.
They're liberals.
They are the liberals in Xi Jinping's China today. Among the intellectuals.
Yeah. All the ones who support Trump are liberals, and they came from that same bunch of liberals who hated socialism and wanted to replace socialism with markets. Now, they couldn't say in the 1990s, I hate socialism. They just talked about markets. I mean, these are people who conflate markets with rights, and who for instance, they don't want anything to do with feminism because that's a distraction and might lead us back to Cultural Revolution. Those are secondary rights. We want our market rights because that will destroy. They're Hayek people. I mean, they're really interesting to talk to them, and because I don't know other people who are like that, but that's
who are these people? The Trump supporters among the liberals.
They're just
I mean, we know some. I don't know if we
subset of
should say.
liberals in China. I mean, I can give names. One of my only friend who's a Trump supporter, a Chinese guy, Gao Chuanxi, who's a professor of constitutional law at, I think, Jiao Tong University in Shanghai, and has spent his life writing very sensible things about Chinese constitutions. But he's one of these people who really believes he's a libertarian at best. And really believes that governments are in the way.
Right.
As well. Yes,
David
I see what you
with.
mean. The libertarians,
Yeah.
Right.
The one thing I'd say for it's kind of heartbreaking because some of these intellectuals I really appreciate. I'm just stunned that they and it was a Taiwan scholar who said to me, you can't really understand the liberals who support Trump without their Cultural Revolution experience. They're a generation that had that. So that's the only thing I would put in there in terms of trying to understand where they're coming from. The other part of what David said is that it is a sobering warning to us, particularly to David and I as non-Chinese. We study China, but we got to be aware that we might project or get wrong. I mean, that's why we read so much and translate so much of them to try to compensate.
Sure. So let's go back to beginning of Xi Jinping's era, which is about 2013. I remember at the time on the internet, a bunch of online influencers, the Da V, the big Vs, a lot of them, they had their account shut because they were very critical of the government. And when Xi Jinping cracked down on the internet, the first thing that he did was to close the Weibo account of these online influencers. And a lot of liberals, I think, were targeted. So in today's public intellectuals in Xi Jinping's China, how would you describe the distribution? It's no longer kind of left liberals heavy. Would you say that it's more right heavy and the liberals have been swept underground? So it's more, the new left aren't that prominent too, right? So are the new confusion in the majority now?
No.
Would you say?
No.
I would say, and Tim, you can please chime in here. I think Xi Jinping, he hasn't succeeded in stopping the pluralism really, but he's toned everything down and flattened things out. It's just
including the new left and the new
no, the new left can say what they want to, but they've kind of for the moment they've kind of won. And I don't know, they seem not to be crowing about it, or this may just be something that doesn't go in the journals that I read. Although I look
but Xi was also cracking down on the new left activists at one point, right?
Yes.
Well, by the time he came to power, I think the new left was pretty much on the side of the state. He was cracking down on
people who were trying to advocate for the new left also got in trouble.
Right. I mean, Wang Hui was anti-Xi Jinping when Bo Xilai went down, for instance. When Bo Xilai was purged, he had been a darling of the new left, and they made a lot of noise right then. So yes, Xi Jinping was highly motivated to shut them up or down as he could. Now, go ahead, Tim, go.
Jessica Teets has got a question in the Q&A that I think is
let's finish this. So how would you describe the distribution?
I think China most of them are still liberals in terms of numbers, but they're getting older. I mean, all these guys are my age or Tim's age, and they're retiring, and they're kind of dinosaurs to younger people. I'm not sure what's replaced them. I think the new Confucians are still there. They'll always be there. There's an openness to Confucianism in Chinese society. It's just you do say it, and a lot of people don't like it, but that there's a resonance, so that they can always get a little bit of, they can get more social response to the new left. The new left is there. I was in Beijing in this summer and I won't name any names here. I had dinner at a very nice restaurant in Beijing with prominent members of the new left. And there was a little bit of talk of Mao, but there was more talk of where to get good red wine and good brandy at good prices. So, as men get older and richer, they smoke cigars and become Republicans, basically.
So the issue that I was trying to get at, the question that I was trying to get at with my last question is really, who do you think have Xi Jinping's ears? I mean, who could actually get to Xi Jinping? My impression is by reading translation of people from Center for Globalization in China, a think tank in China. They have a bunch of young people who write Substacks, and like David, they translate prominent speeches of people like Yao Yang. My impression that those people actually trying to put forward some policies, and they are probably quite prominent relative to the liberals in China today. So I was trying to get at is, in Xi Jinping's China today, who do you think is more influential among the different types of intellectuals? Is
somebody like Yao Yang is trying hard to do that. I don't know if he succeeds or not. By now,
right.
Xi Jinping sort of lets it be known what he wants to hear, and then people try to write, I think, in that vein. And that doesn't tend to go in the sort of journals that I read that much. It's, I don't know, Tim, do you have any idea?
Yeah, I do. I think that but exactly what you said, David. Xi Jinping lets you know what he wants to hear. And so for the self-respecting intellectuals, that's not an option.
Don't want to do that, right?
Right. You're just asking, but for the generation, this is Jessica's thing, the younger generation who's grown up in a good China, and now it's not so good, so now they're worried. They think that only the state's going to fix this. So there's a generational split. I think there's fewer liberals amongst the younger generation. I would agree.
Yeah, I agree.
And I got part of that impression reading your translations, David. You know, but the one thing I want to put to it is Liu Qing did a wonderful piece back in the early 2000s that we did in the translations, and it's on David's website, on Chinese liberalism, where he said, look, the WTO and all this marketization has not made China democratize, but it has irrevocably pluralized Chinese society. And Xi Jinping does not get it. The fundamental disjunction is between the monism of Xi Jinping's Leninist approach and the pluralism, the plurality, or whatever you want to use, the plural society. It's not a commitment to liberal values. It's just having a wide range of different values. And that's the disconnect. And I'm stumbling because I can't think of who is a legitimate intellectual who has Xi Jinping's ear other than Wang Huning.
Okay, so there's still plurality of intellectuals in China today, which is good to hear. Yeah. Okay, let's go to Q&A. Jeffrey Allen, how do the concepts of ideological governance and self-revolution explain or compensate for the CCP's loss of credibility due to the application of zero tolerance for COVID-19? And do party ideologues address this issue, or do they sidestep it?
That's all you, Tim.
Oh, lucky me. I think, again, it's generational difference and also social sector difference. And so the millennials are really put out because they have never been treated this way before with the Shanghai lockdown. That's why you got the A4 paper stuff, because these are people like, people being locked up and having officials kick your door down and spray you with stuff. That happens to peasants. That doesn't happen to me. And now it happened to me, and I'm not happy. Older ones have been on the rodeo before. They've had Liu Si, they've had Wang Ge, they've seen these things. So I think what the party says is tough. It's just like their view in Xinjiang. Look, tough measures are necessary. That's why we succeed. And if you don't like it, you're weak. So that's their answer. And if you bug us about it, you're a problem. And do you like your WeChat? Do you like WeChat Pay? Maybe you just need to take a rest for 2 weeks. Just have your WeChat blocked for 2 weeks.
So the party would trump most things in China today.
So I would characterize the party's response as doubling down on their message.
Right. Okay. Question from Enya. How do you think views about the government in Xi differ across different regions, specifically Beijing and Shanghai, and other strategies Xi uses differ by regions?
I have nothing to say about regions. I just really don't know.
Yeah. So
we
need another person on the panel.
Yeah. I would say it probably differs more by age group. That would be my guess.
It certainly differs by age group. It might differ by region too. I mean, I just don't know.
Yeah.
What do you see?
I think it will be different by age. Regions depends. I think by income group and what they consume in terms of information.
Yeah.
Anyway, next question, Mr. Ownby, how is the new Confucianism different from traditional Confucianism?
Ooh, we got 13 minutes left. Let's see what I can do. Confucianism pretty well died as an institutionalized set of ideas in the early 20th century. They were still out there in the society, but it didn't join up with politics as China revolutionized in the 20s and 30s. Where it went, it stayed alive among the people in sort of popularized or vulgarized ways. Then it went, there was also a handful of intellectuals that tried very hard to transform Confucianism into a modern philosophy by doing very, very difficult things, like going to Germany and studying for 15 years and then rereading Confucianism and Buddhism and making this huge new synthesis that I find completely unreadable. I just don't know what they're doing. But anyway, there was those guys, and they had some influence in Taiwan and Hong Kong and the US, but in China from 49, there was almost no influence until the 1980s. The new Confucianism is really a tradition reinvented, or whatever the word, Hobsbawm's word is. I mean, they draw what they want to from it, but most of the main participants in it had no training whatsoever in Confucianism, because where would they be trained, right? I mean, so they're all self-learned or self-taught, and some of the best ones, the most interesting ones, kind of did it over a weekend, it seems to me. But they learned the vocabulary, and then they added it to their other larger cultural and political aims to fashion something that's quite different. And there was a break. They were happy to be new Confucians, like the new Confucians in the diaspora, for a while. But when they decided they'd learned enough, they started calling themselves mainland new Confucians and sort of dissing the older, less politically astute ones elsewhere in the world. So that's a quick answer. I hope it made some sense.
Okay, Jessica Teets has a question. Do you see a generation gap with younger intellectuals holding different beliefs than older ones? So back to the question of age. In my research with local government officials, we see a dramatic drop in those with liberal values by age, with the younger generation more in line with political centralization being the key to China's success. Do you see anything similar with public intellectuals?
Yes,
So
very much so.
Younger people prefer political centralization.
I don't know if they, well, some do. They're just not as enamored of the old liberal tropes and ideas. That just doesn't get their blood moving. Even people like my friend Xiang Biao, with whom I worked on one project, he was born in what, 72, 74, so he's young from where I'm sitting, but he's not spring chicken. No, his ideas are more, I mean, he's not new left, but he's quite open to, you know, a strong state. So the idea of a strong state, I think, is quite appealing. And as you said, as unemployment has become a real problem in China, or youth unemployment has become a real problem in China over the last couple of years, you see them saying, hey, I kind of am nostalgic for that good old day, the good old days when the government would give me a job. I mean, gap year sounds fun when it ends in, employment, but if it's just a gap year to keep you off the market for a year and nothing happens, then that's not so great.
So this is the Xiang Biao who used to be at Oxford, who's now at Max Planck? Okay.
Yeah, no, he's a Max Planck, right.
Yeah, that's really kind of interesting. I think people who grew up in different age in the 80s also are actually not as liberal as people who enjoyed the fruits of liberal reform earlier.
Exactly.
I would give a bit of history to that, which is, I think, a lot that what drove a commitment to liberalism was a response to the Cultural Revolution and the failures of late Maoism. And the new generation or generations have come up under where they just didn't have the extreme dysfunction of the party state system. And then they look at increasing dysfunction in the West. And they're like, So it's not unrelated to the context of their life experience.
Right. So the younger people saw the extreme of market reform and wanting something that could move from the left to the center, whereas people who grew up in the 60s and 50s saw the extreme of
Maoism,
the excess of Maoism and wanted to move to more liberal reform. That's interesting. So I wonder how it would be like in, let's say, 10, 20 years time, when people have seen the extreme of Xi Jinping's policy, right?
Yeah, good question. Yeah.
I'd like to, if I may, jump back. There's a later question about Chinese bureaucrats and the transformational role they are to play.
Which
it's from and I think it's a relevant question that I'm concerned with and interested in, because I've suggested that there's a huge gap between Chinese society and what the party state and Xi Jinping are pushing for with this ideological governance. But it's a good question: is how much take-up is there in the 100 million party members to be transformational bureaucrats? And I don't have any systematic study. I would love to hear from others what they get, but my impression is there is take-up because of a traditional kind of noblesse oblige view of senior bureaucrats, that they know better and will tell you how to do it. And this is what Haratsky, in The Velvet Prison wrote. There's an attraction to intellectuals from Stalinism and Leninism, which is you get to be the teachers of the people. And
so who is the person who asked that question? I'm trying to see it on my list.
Julia Bentley.
One
of your monk school members.
Sanjay has a question. Today, the liberal response to the dilemmas facing China's political economy is clear and unsurprising. What are the diagnoses of the new left and the new Confucians, and what reforms do they advocate? An additional question is, how do these intellectual groups view the aspirations or tensions of emerging power in the global South versus the US? Global South vis-a-vis the US. But let's go to his earlier questions, which is, what are the diagnoses of new left and the new Confucian, and the new Confucians, and what reforms do they advocate with respect to the dilemmas facing China's political economy?
Well, the new left, they're basically on side with Xi Jinping. So proposing reforms, I don't know where they stand. I mean, they're a mixed bag too, I guess. I mean, they weigh in, as do liberals, on issues like, common prosperity, this kind of thing. And that's where, I mean, what Tim's quote about that at the beginning touched on these debates, which are very alive, I think, whether the state should really take over or allow markets to continue to do their work. This is something that's debated a lot. And I think the new left generally wants the state to do more, but some of these things are policy debates that don't make it into the things that I read that much, so I'm not quite sure. New Confucians, I mean, they want to replace Marxism with Confucianism in some way, and then I mean, you can find concrete reform proposals, but they go back a long way. I mean, Jiang Qing had all these ideas about replacing the entire structure of governance in China with a tricameral body of Confucian descendants and elected officials, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I don't think anyone ever took that particularly seriously. And sorry, I don't know if anyone has any particular proposals for reform right now. Usually when you talk about reform in China, my impression is the question is whether to go ahead and allow markets to go further, because it seems to me basically the case that markets have made China rich, or do we, ratchet that down, bring that back in, and let the state do more? Though that to me, I don't know, Timothy, what do you think the major debates are in China these days, or do you know of any concrete proposals for reform that either of those groups might have?
No, and so what I think is two things. One is the people that David and I can get to are, I think, dispirited. They feel that anything other than embellishing on whatever she has set out is not welcome. So therefore, they do other things. But I think there are intelligent people, and they've gone on these think tanks, and they're on the inside. They're going behind the paywall, and that's one we just haven't been able to get access to. And so I would not underestimate the amount of intelligence that the party has been able to entice, or to welcome, right?
Yeah, no, I think that's an interesting point. What David mentioned earlier. I think the people who propose common prosperity or the redistribution are coming from a new left, right?
Yes.
So I think policies wise, it makes a lot of sense. But I think what is the bottleneck right now is no one is really saying anything about institutional reform, which is, I think, the root cause of the problem. If you don't reform the institutions, they wouldn't be able to come up with the right policies. So
Yeah,
I think we have time. Yeah.
I'm sorry, like Tim said, a lot of it goes on inside. And to me, that's a big mystery. I don't study the party, but there's 900 million members, 90 million members, I'm sorry, some of whom must surely be intellectuals and who read books. So I just don't know. I mean, they're required to be obedient and put into practice what the party says, but they're also thinking people. So I don't know.
Sure. But it's really the very few at the top who is making the decision.
Of course, sure.
Yeah. Okay.
This is a time of orthodoxy.
Yeah, so we have time for one last question. Zheng Ma's question is a little bit long. I will try to summarize. As a Chinese Muslim researcher who is well established in Chinese scholarship, I want to explicate that the Chinese intellectuals respond to the governance with more subtle ways of resistance and indifference. Mm-hmm. Something really shocks me is that the negation, stigmatization, and victimization of Chinese academic credentials in my Chinese Muslim family and community and in Canadian academic institutions. Question is, why are well-established researchers in Chinese scholarship required to pursue another set of graduate degrees to survive in Canadian academic institutions? Are they really? Why have my Chinese Muslim family and community teachings been victimized merely as a weapon for ideological struggles between East and West? So it's really about the plight of Chinese Muslims.
Yes.
I'm afraid I can't speak to that.
And I can't either, but we can acknowledge that there are whole racial and ethnic issues that we have not been addressing explicitly that are powerful and important.
Yes.
And people like the more moderates like Ilham Tohti are behind jail, right? I mean, right. So you have extremists out in the street, but the moderates back in.
And the news from the party, the news from the party is not good, because the Zhonghua Minzu, the Chinese nation that Xi Jinping is talking about, is an assimilationist one. So, and that's Hu Lianhe and Huang Gang. David translated that back in 2011. They're saying their approach to ethnic relations is you're welcome to become Han, essentially. That's how I read it.
Yeah.
That's not good.
Sure. That's worrying. So I'm afraid that's all we have the time for. Thank you so much to Tim and David for a really stimulating discussion about intellectuals in Xi Jinping's China. And thank you everyone for coming. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you much.
Okay, a very good morning to folks in Toronto and the East Coast, and good afternoon to people in Britain. My name is Lynette Ong, Professor of Political Science at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto. I wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been